I turn to the physical, fragmented, difficult market that you mentioned and that everybody worries about. The basic story that we are going to try and tell, and I'll tell this gist of the story before I get into the details. The basic story that we're going to try and tell is that part of what explains food inflation is the structure of the market. The recent food inflation. So I'm going back to the question that we started with this morning, that there has been, after 2006, an increase in food inflation. And a part of that lies in the explanation, lies in the structure of the market. We are not discussing MSP. So we are not discussing that part of the market that is rigged, clearly, plainly, openly rigged, where we don't even ask questions about why prices are the way they are. The government sets prices based on whatever. So we are talking about those prices which are supposed to be market determined, and that's where we ask the question, so what is the nature of the market there, and why do we think that that matters, and what needs to be done about it? Again, going back to the story of the last 4-5 years, we see that there has been an increasing demand for labor-intensive crops, and this is more now than in the pre-2000s or in the early 2000s, whether it is because of changes, because of high income growth, whether it is because of changes in rural income growth or Manrega or whatever. We're not going into those questions. We're simply looking at the facts about the fact that there has been an increase in demand for labor-intensive crops. Some crops like vegetables and others are more labor-intensive. There has been a rising cost of labor. Again, we are not going to, this paper does not go into why labor costs have risen. I don't want to get into an argument with Surjit, who has his own explanations for labor cost rising, but just that labor costs have risen, and that these are markets where there is markup pricing. So the nature of these markets is that there is cost plus pricing, and these are not competitive markets. So, when we think about perfectly competitive markets, one would assume that, there is a market price that is determined in a competitive manner, whereas here these are markets with high entry barriers, and that there is the legal and regulatory structure actually supports collusion. So you have oligopsonistic and oligopolistic markets, and we'll discuss those. And that's the narrow question on which we are going to focus. And our argument is you need to create competitive markets for food. There needs to be a national market for food. And then we limit ourselves to the question of, so what can the central government do? Because there seems to be this sense that the central government can do nothing, that it is a state subject and it has to be handled at the level of the states, and we need to somebody mentioned that we need to discuss with various state governments what to do, and that is the impression that we live with today, that it is not food inflation, not even food inflation. So I'm actually going to move away from the question of the recent inflation. But then the food market is something that state governments deal with, and it's not something that the central government can do anything about. So the outline of the presentation is that we'll just point out a few things about the recent spike in food prices and the regulatory framework for food markets, which provides the background for our proposals. And then Shubho and Anirudh will take you through the proposals that we have. I should emphasize that this is very preliminary work. We've just started 2-3 months ago, barely 2-3 months ago, thinking about some of these issues. Many of these ideas are not heard of, so please don't go into a state of shock. So this is an attempt to say that there are many items that have been responsible for food inflation. It is not just cereal and MSP, and in fact, as I said, we don't even talk about cereal and and the minimum support price. So the vegetables, milk, egg, meat, fish. And you often see that there, for some time, one article leads the spike in prices, and then after some time, that kind of, prices come down, and then a different item leads the increase in prices and the inflation. So it is not a problem that is specific to, say, onions. Another impression that people have that is just onion prices. No, it's not just onion prices. We've seen a change happen. There have been both demand pull factors, high growth of urban and rural incomes. There has been a changing composition. Now, why would as incomes have grown in India, the demand for food has changed. It will towards non-cereals. But this has happened more recently, perhaps, after the 2000s when GDP growth has been high. So incomes have risen higher. There is also a cost push element, that there's a sharp growth in rural wages for whatever reasons, and rise in production costs, which Rudrani spoke about in the morning. And particularly when you think about when rural wages are rising and the demand for labor-intensive crops is rising. So you get this double effect, that you are getting an increase in demand for, say, vegetables at a time when wages are rising. Then the whole food index moves more than it would have had either of the two not been the case. So this combination has a double effect, whammy. Consumption patterns, and this is so obvious that we don't need to talk about this, that you want meat, etc. Then this is trying to show you that how the labor intensity of different crops differs. So cereals are far less labor intensive. Wheat is less labor intensive than vegetables. And so you're getting this double effect from there. The rural wages have increased far more sharply after 2008 than before. And so you're getting this double effect of consumption patterns shifting to more labor-intensive crops, a rise in wages pushing up labor costs. And this might have also led to an increase in MSP. But that's not what we are discussing in this presentation. But there has been an increase. There has been an increase in labor costs, and this combination is giving you both a demand side effect and a cost push effect. In addition to that, there is markup pricing. So if you look at demand and supply, we look at it slightly differently from how Rudrani looked at it this morning, which is that we are saying that price equilibrates the market. So whatever is the demand is whatever is the supply. So, it's not that we make any demand projections that are independent of the price of that time. So at the end of the day, what people buy is what the demand at that price is. If you notice, both have increased. So this impression one often comes across, which is that, Indian agriculture is supply constrained, gives an impression as if supply has not been increasing. Not true. Supply has also been increasing. That is why the per capita consumption of meat, milk, pulses, and so on have been increasing as well. Of cereals, the least, but that is to be expected because incomes rise. People want more non-cereals. But both demand has increased and supply has increased. At the same time, prices have increased. And in some cases, prices have increased a couple of years ago, come down sharply. So if you look at protein prices, they did rise very sharply. If you remember a number of speeches by Subir Gokarn, who was then Deputy Governor RBI, saying that inflation is because of high protein prices. But then that went away. And then inflation is because, until 2 months ago, inflation was because of high vegetable prices. And after December, even that seems to be going away. But basically, that prices have increased while both demand and supply has increased. So what's happening? There is, if we look at the market for food, then you have the farmer, where it's a competitive market. Anybody can produce any product that they like. You have a pre-harvest contractor who is usually a local trader who is usually a local trader, a commission agent or a broker who is APMC regulated, and that is the APMC at the level of that district. Then the food moves to the wholesaler who, say in a mandi, say Azadpur mandi, is also APMC regulated. And then the retailer and the consumer, where again the market becomes a competitive market. So in the middle, which is where produce is bought from the farmer, and then later when the produce is sold to the retailer. At both levels, there is a market where there are entry barriers, where everybody cannot start buying or selling. So it's an uncompetitive market. What are the consequences of this market? Very briefly, I mean, Econ 101, markup pricing. So you have oligopolistic markets, markup pricing. In the oligopsonistic market, the farmer gets less than what he would have otherwise got. And so what you're left with is a big margin. What is also a characteristic of an uncompetitive market is that the players there are very happy with whatever they are doing. They don't need to push costs down. They don't invest in infrastructure. So investment in infrastructure, marketing in the shops or go-downs or transport is inadequate. And this multiplies up to the level of the country. Just to give you a sense of what this means. So one, if you look at what the middlemen get, the share of middlemen is as high as 50% nearly in fruit. Also, the market cost is very high because there is inadequate investment in market infrastructure. So what the farmer gets is sometimes an average of, let's say, roughly 50% of what the consumer pays. When we look at what happens in direct selling markets, so very little small efforts have been made here and there to set up direct selling from the farmer to the consumer. There the farmer gets about 85 to 95% of the price that the consumer pays. Now if you think of what this does to the supply response of farmers, so let's say an additional 1 kg of X is demanded, the consumer will pay an additional 200 rupees for that extra 1 kg to be produced, and the farmer will be getting 100 rupees for that to be produced. So the margin there is very, very big, and that is something that is because of the structure of the market at both these levels. Why is this the case? Because those two levels are regulated by APMCs. What do APMC laws do? They say who can the farmers sell to? Who can participate in these markets? Where can the markets be established? So they have a go down where they say only people who have a shop in this market, a structure that has been set up by the state government, will be allowed to trade in food. And who gets that structure? There are a few limited shops, very often, friends, family of existing traders, or even the trader in another name. They retain they have the shop and they get the license to trade. So it's a few people in a limited space actually being given the opportunity to collude. They're not scattered all over the place. So they're being actually given an opportunity to collude. There are various anti-competitive practices where they don't say there is no transparent criteria on the basis of how licenses will be given, whether they'll be given in a specific period, for how long they will be given. So often they are given for short periods, like 2 to 3 years, and so nobody wants to invest in that infrastructure. And basically there are entry barriers, and this is a very uncompetitive market. Often the transactions are supposed to be by law open auction-based transactions, but some surveys show that barely 30% of the transactions are open transactions and transparent. So I now turn to how have other countries dealt with this. So we're not the only ones, to have inherited such structures. We might be the only ones who haven't moved ahead and changed these. But we've moved ahead on a lot of other commodities, but on this we haven't. So let's look at, I think we found a few examples, Korea, South Africa, a bit in Australia. We studied a few international examples. What we found in South Africa was very similar to what we have. APMCs, fragmented, so state-wise, their barriers on interstate transactions, in addition to the kind of, so they again maybe set up with very noble objectives of promoting marketing of agricultural produce, but ending up with creating monopolies, having very high and volatile food prices. So in '96, they passed the Marketing of Agricultural Produce Act, where they actively closed down all these APMC sort of structures. And in addition, and that's where we think it's very important. So it's not just, that we need to repeal the APMCs and that will be the story. In addition to that, they created a board that would, on an ongoing basis, identify any controls that were being put in, any barriers that were being put in, and dismantle all those controls. What did it do to food prices? This is striking. I mean, the dashed line there tells you the date at which they brought the new law in. And before that, food prices were high and volatile. One is POPSA and the other is year-on-year inflation. The smoother one is the year-on-year inflation. So the volatility and the high levels of inflation came down sharply from the period when the market was uncompetitive and fragmented. And you have these low levels of food inflation after that. So we think that there are very important lessons for India, and that we need to think about how can we create a competitive and national market for food. And is it something that our constitution gives us space to do? Shubho?
We have a competitive market today for most goods. You can buy cell phones in a port in Bombay, transport them to any part of India, and sell them without meeting many barriers. Yes, you will meet some state borders, but if you have your papers right, it does not take much time. But that was not the case for most commodities in India for many, many years. Till 1989, we had a cement control order or an aluminium controlled order, which were very interesting laws. It told you how much cement you could produce, where you could sell cement to, how much you could sell it to. You had to be an authorized purchaser to purchase cement. You had to be an authorized dealer to sell cement. You would fix the amount of cement which any person could get, and so on and so forth. And it's history, but it's very interesting history when people would store up their cement quotas to build a house. And today when we look back at those laws, we do not even debate whether those laws should come back or we should modernize those laws. We did not replace the cement control order or the aluminium control order with the reformed cement control order or aluminium control order. The industry bodies from where I was doing the research praise how these orders have been taken away, and they celebrate the full freedom that they get. On the other hand, it seems the same laws, the same provisions are quite comfortably sitting in our agricultural laws. And it is quite sad. It seems that because there was an organized lobby for manufacturers, these laws have been totally dismantled with. But we seem to subject Indian farmers to the same controls and same levels, either through a paternalistic presumption that a large company is better at understanding what needs to be produced and a farmer is essentially not smart enough to know what he should produce, or some other argument. Similarly, there has been a lot of efforts at modernizing some of these laws. I mean, we got rid of the cement control order. We did not come up with a modern cement control order. But with the agricultural laws which place the same restrictions, we continuously attempt to modernize them. without understanding sometimes the perverse economic games that we set up in those laws. So one example is the APMC law. In the 90s, you had physical trading in the Bombay Stock Exchange. You would call up your broker, he would talk to another broker who was his friend, and they would be sitting in the same physical exchange building, and you would get the worst price of the day. The buyer would get the worst price of the day, the seller would get the worst price of the day. Once we destroyed the physical market with electronic trading, we broke down cartelization. When two buyers cannot sit together at one place, it disables them from coming towards to an agreement. On the other hand, the same law that we apply to agricultural markets requires all the buyers and all the sellers to come and sit at the same place. That we might not be getting it, but we might be promoting the perverse cartelization through the law. We are mandating it through the law that all buyers come sit together at one place. We had orders on how much aluminium you could hold, what you could use it for, where you could store. We have done away with it. But for all food products, we continually use this power. We continually put up controls whenever there is a shortage. We notify goods without any system of pre-notified, pre-known limits that would be put up. So suddenly traders are hit by an order that this commodity is under essential commodities, and you have purchased it, but now ex post facto you have to go and register yourself under the Act. Even some of the modern APMC laws have regressive provisions. We have allowed private markets to set up, but some state laws say that the private market cannot be within 25 kilometers of an old public market. I mean, if somebody told me that a mobile phone company shop cannot be within 25 kilometers of another, we would be shocked, and we would not even accept that kind of regulation. But inflicting the same level of regulation on farmers seems to be just fair game in India. The argument we are trying to state is that we need a competitive market for food, not a regulated market, not a controlled market of this nature, but a competitive market for food. Goods, and what does this competitive market should do? It should have the ability to move goods freely across and everywhere in the country. Market participants like traders, buyers, customers should not have to register separately with each state government or APMC, which we need today, which just increases transaction costs. And we need a general protection for all interstate and intrastate commerce in food products, and not for specific goods which we have exempted and created specific cases for. There are two approaches to do this. First, we'll have to remove almost all coercive provisions under the APMC law. And if you do it, there's almost nothing left in the APMC law except for price information dissemination, which may be a public good which the state should continue to do. But requiring farmers to sell only in the APMC, requiring farmers and purchasers to pay APMC fee even when they are not using APMC facilities is quite strange. I mean, it is asking you to pay the National Stock Exchange fees when you don't even transact on it. Similar provisions have to just go, and we have to create a legal solution for a national market. It is not only enough that we stop APMCs from functioning the way they do, but from states in interfering in transportation of agricultural goods across state lines. APMCs try to create markets. A large portion of our legal government policy has been the idea of creating markets. What is creating markets? We will provide infrastructure. We'll tell this is the place where the buyer will come, this is the place where the seller will come, to the extent of specifying the contract between the buyer and the seller, including the terms that should be included. That is not the way good legal systems work. A good legal system is not interested in creating, but rather enabling. And we chose to amend the title of our presentation also to highlight the point that we should move away from an attempt to create markets by saying you are a buyer, you are a seller, this is the registration form and this is the agreement you will get into, to a system where you create, to enable a market where the parties' rights and liabilities are known beforehand to a reasonable extent, and parties can contract them out as and when required. For example, the model APMC contract farming prescribed contract requires the mention of how much land the farmer will sow. There are many cases where we talk to some of the agricultural buyers who are not interested in where the land of the farmer is or where he will sow. He is only interested in buying the produce at a predetermined price on a predetermined date. But the law requires him to mention a piece of information which is irrelevant and useless. Some states have done this, and Bihar has done one step high. It has just gone and outright repealed the APMC Act. There have been some studies which show that Patna market is the least transaction cost. The bid offer spread in the Patna market seem to be the lowest amongst that they were studied. And there are a large number of other administrative and legal burdens on the modern marketing of food. This is not just limited to APMCs, but arise from taxation laws or mandi laws of related ones. So, for example,
Shubho, you need to go a bit faster.
If you are moving goods across APMC lines, the APMC authorities can stop and open your truck, so on and so forth. From this point, I would like to just point out that there is a lot of discussion that this can only be done by state governments and coordination with state governments. We just looked at the constitution to see if the central government and the parliament has some authority, and we found out that they do.
So from our short analysis, there is no significant legal constraint to the creation of a competitive market or the creation of a national market. Part 13 of the Constitution is very clear that trade and commerce and intercourse throughout India should be free. The other provisions of Part 13 actually impose very limited restrictions on what states and the central government can do, subject to the provision, subject as a restriction on free trade, commerce and intercourse. Moreover, the lists within the 7th schedule also give adequate power to the central government. The sum of all these provisions is that interstate trade and commerce can be regulated freely by the central government. Trade, commerce within the state and production, supply and distribution of goods within the state is a state subject, but subject to entry 33 of the concurrent list, which basically empowers, so a central law would trump a state law, to enable or regulate trade, commerce and the production, supply and distribution of foodstuffs. So there's very clear legislative power for Parliament to go and dismantle state APMC laws and replace it with a modern framework for a competitive and national market. And we found 2 5-judge bench decisions. The second one is an old case which expounds upon the nature and context of Article 301, and it basically very clearly says that it imposes a constitutional limitation on the legislative power of Parliament and the legislatures of states. And the first one is in fact is a case directly on the point of the nature of APMCs in India. And it very clearly says that the provisions of entry 33 of list 3 override powers of the state legislature if it's a law dealing with trade, commerce and the production, supply or distribution of foodstuffs. So, I mean, these are very conclusive determinations or interpretations by the Supreme Court of the constitutional power of the central government. So, just to bring it all together, what can Parliament do? It can set up a national body to promote free trade, and it can create a unified mechanism to license and regulate national traders. It can create mechanisms that would exempt such traders from APMCs and the provisions of Essential Commodities Act and the warehousing laws. It also has the power to prevent states from making rules which hinder free trade. This would not be limited to just APMC laws, but also to other administrative provisions which create a significant hurdle in the movement of goods. For example, a lot of tax enforcement mechanisms require that all trucks carrying food be stopped at the end of a particular market area. And just because trucks have to stop for 4 to 6 to 8 hours, get their goods inspected, there is a loss in value of the goods they're carrying. So the government of India or the parliament has the power to prevent states from making such rules. And it can also set up a body to identify such administrative measures which are effectively technical barriers to interstate trade. So what are the solutions we are looking at?
The first one is to establish a national body to license and regulate market for food. It would be ideal if this body just gave the right to everybody to move food or food products across the national borders without any restriction and trade in them. That should just exempt all national traders from state regulation of APMCs to purchase and sell, and all national traders to transport and store food across state lines without any requirement of Essential Commodities Act or APMC rules. As in South Africa, we need to actively dismantle barriers to trade. And we have an example of this in WTO. Once WTO capped duties, nations started using technical barriers to trade to prevent meeting WTO obligations. So then WTO has come up with a large number of conventions on preventing technical barriers to trade. Similarly, the central government should understand that we are the WTO for India, and we should prevent any barriers to trade which are between states. And it's an obligation, apart from sound economics, it's a legal obligation to allow free trade within the country. And that body just has to identify the barriers, require them to be removed. Wherever there is tax, the states have a right to collect tax, but the procedure cannot be at the cost of national trade. And we can just standardize and simplify tax procedures through sealing and electronic filing, which can reduce the requirement of stopping vehicles to movement of goods. Laws like APMC, however good they are, however modernized might be just promoting the exactly opposite thing we want. They might be promoting cartelization. If 5 cement producers today in India sat in a room and decided at what price they would buy lime from lime producers, it's an offense under the Competition Act. But it seems exactly the same thing is legal and not only required, mandated under law when you want to buy an agricultural commodities. We seem to be promoting anti-competition systems. And there is a lot of attempt at democratizing APMCs, which again is not where we should be looking at functioning of democracy. Democracy should be functioning to set up the rules of the game, not the price of markets, which should be by bargaining and not through votes. Essential Commodities Act and export bans also provide us with short-term gains. But what they do, as Ila pointed out, is they do not give the price signal back to the producers that these goods need to be produced in more amount. They destroy the ability of international traders to depend on long-term contracts of production from India, because arbitrarily exports may be stopped in any day. So it harms India's ability to export. And it also destroys the ability to trade nationally, because suddenly a trader might exceed a previously unknown level of sugar in a warehouse and be then prosecuted under the Essential Commodities Act. And there might be many more laws which are prohibiting this, and there might be laws that come out in the future which may prohibit this, and we have to systematically dismantle them as South Africa did.
Thanks. It's a fascinating paper, and I think I need to read this a couple of more times to respond on some of the far-reaching suggestions. But very quick reaction. Essentially, 2 sets of themes. First is the economic part, where you essentially say demand is increased, so has supply, and yet prices have gone up. Perhaps a part of the explanation, you don't say this very explicitly, but I think that's what you imply, is the absence of a national market. For the price rise, the absence of a national market and barriers to barriers on trade, barriers on movement is an important part of the explanation. And presumably, therefore, creating a national market will be an important part of the proposed solution. Now, if I've understood this right, the last part is constitutionally this is doable, notwithstanding the beliefs that we have initially that, to the contrary. Now, taking the economics part, I think you need to, I assume, since you say it in some other form, there are 2 points. One point relates to intermediation costs, which has nothing to do with national barrier or anything. There is just high intermediation costs in agriculture, foodstuffs. Middlemen are creaming off a lot more than you would see in some other sector, presumably lack of competition or whatever, and a lot of monopsony and oligopsony kind of situations. So that's point one. Point two is the national market related, which is separate.
And come back to it.
Yeah. So I think the two, they may be related, but they are two distinct points, in my opinion, requiring distinct solutions. But to come to my comments, fundamentally, no disagreement with any of these individual propositions. As I said, I think there are two separate things. It would help, I don't know if we have this, do we have regional data on availability and prices? Can you show me that at a particular point in time, when potato is $2 in Uttarakhand, it is $35 in Delhi? And I believe there is data of this kind. We have data of this kind within Karnataka, the state that I am familiar with. So I think it will help if we can get that kind of data. But I'll move straight to the constitutional sides of the paper, because that's the part which interests me. I want to go back to an article that Anirudh is familiar with, a piece that I wrote for the seminar last year, where I have sort of tentatively proposed a thesis, which is that the Indian Constitution as interpreted by the judiciary has essentially been a framework of strong state, weak markets. It's in the design. That's the point that I make. And weak national markets. And I illustrate it with a set of points. Allocation of subjects. Now, notwithstanding the point that you make, the Atiyabari point one, that it is not merely national movement, but even intra-state movement, I'm not sure how it will work in practice. For instance, take sugar, the example that you gave of cement. Today, in India, it is entirely legal, and governments regularly prescribe areas where sugarcane can be grown, to whom can the cane be sold, at what price, and once you sell the cane, the sugar factory, which sugar factory will purchase cane from which farmer, at what price, in what manner, time frame, etc. will the price be paid. This is just on the sugar cane. I have not even come to sugar. And this is entirely legal. The Constitution of India has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to say this is entirely legal. So notwithstanding the Atiyabari point one, within the state, I don't think it will be at all easy for us to remove barriers. And in a state like Karnataka, Sanjay will confirm, Kolar, 70 or 68 kilometers from Bangalore, throughout the tomato season, it's 20 paisa per kg in Kolar, and it's $10 in Bangalore. Now, this is not a national movement problem. This is some other problem, and that's the sense in which I am saying these two need to be separate. The fragmented markets, in my view, and since I don't want to deny Sanjay and Anandi the time to speak, in my opinion, some bit of it is written into the Constitution, for which we will need to go back to our original dream. ELRC, Economic Legislative Reforms Commission, not merely FSLRC. And that's where we started, if you recall. We thought the problem was intractable as LRC. But I think we need that because MFIs, to give a completely different example, microfinance institutions, NBFCs have demonstrated that if a state government decides to interfere, it can completely undo what the central government can do. Karnataka did this recently in 2004. It passed an act called Karnataka Prohibition of Charging Exorbitant Interest Act of 2004 issued notice to all the RBI regulated NBFCs, and the High Court of Karnataka said this is constitutionally valid. So even in a sector where we think it's entirely Government of India, List 1, RBI, there are number of entries in the Constitution which allow this kind of interference, quote unquote, by the state, which can undo a lot of the national design. The example that you took, dematerialization, the NSC, National Electronic Market, it came about because we made a constitutional amendment in 97. We could not do it, and we created an electronic market, and we could do this only for equities. We have not been able to do this for bonds, and that's one reason why you don't have a flourishing corporate bond market, because the barriers are in the Constitution. You can't set it right by an amendment to a law. Quick last point, which is a political economy question. Surjit Balla tells me in the morning that farmers are so important that Government of India is prepared to let inflation run at whatever percentage, because they can determine MSP at levels which are stratospheric. So if the entire APMC setup is so demonstrably anti-farmer, why is it that state governments, which are all elected on pro-farmer planks, are doing nothing about APMCs? So I think the story is more complex. If it was so straightforward anti-farmer, they would have been dismantled. Because the election sort of framework should be in favor of dismantling. I think we need to investigate this a little more.
Anandi for. I think the overall intent of the presentation, nobody has a quarrel with. There are just a lot of caveats and a lot of issues which I think we need to address. Some KP has pointed out. In the context of the National Spot Exchange, the Ministry of Agriculture had looked at whether the NCDEX, for instance, could be permitted to have a pan-India license. I don't think they were able to find an unequivocal yes. They did examine the Ministry of Law. It would help if you could check out what exactly. I'm not privy to what happened in the file, but I do know that they were not able to unequivocally say that it's possible. The second is that the Artiya is a much maligned term, and we have had all conferences, seminars talking about this cost plus oligopolistic cartelization that takes place in the marketplace. Please remember that when organized firms got into this business, without exception, all of them have done poorly. Adani Fresh, Reliance Fresh, whenever they wanted to get into this business because they also saw there's so much cream, because that's what the literature said. They got into it, and all of them, without exception, have just burnt their fingers and not been able to make money. It's not because they didn't get licenses. They all got licenses. They were certainly more powerful than the poor Artiya. If you tell me that Reliance and Adani are not more influential, then nobody's going to accept that. They have not been able to do this. Godrej, Adani, any organized retail domestic firm has not been able to, at least in fruits and vegetables. So there's some value that this guy is providing, which needs to be recognized. One is that there is a small and marginal farmer, so there's aggregation of produce. Second, when he makes money, he is not making money on the commission. He is making money because he's been a smart speculator. He has also got a proprietary book. So what percentage of the money is because he has played the business game well. Even the Kacha Artiya, incidentally, there are two types of Artiya. So there's a village level aggregator. Who is aggregating the producing, bringing it to the marketplace? The farmer is, except for Punjab, Haryana and some organized market, the farmer is not directly coming to the marketplace. So you are providing an aggregation. He is taking a call on what the price will be the next day, because he is paying off the farmer in many cases, not in cash, but in terms of price, the previous. So he is taking a call in the market. So I think we need to recognize that value. Secondly, in fruit and vegetables, there is a certain amount of deterioration and decay which takes place by the time it's actually traded. So to compare that price with the retail price is not always fair. There is some deterioration, like there is value addition in non-perishables. The other aspect that we're talking about is that whenever states have tried to dismantle legislations, it's not always helped. Bihar is example. Why Bihar? Markets are dysfunctional. In large parts of East India, Northeast India, Kerala never had an APMC. It's nobody's case that there is more efficiency in the supply chain where APMC acts don't exist. In fact, Bihar, the reverse has happened. Now the farmer doesn't know where to bring his produce. And if you go to Purnia, where we work extensively, even the basic infrastructure which existed in the mandi doesn't exist. In the rains, you can't bring corn to the mandi. So we do the procurement on the national highway. I don't know what Olam buys corn, but those who buy corn, you're buying it on the national highway straight in trucks. There's no mandi where you can even display or even stock the goods. So I think you did make a point that you can't create structures with dismantle without creating an alternative. So you do require a physical place because of fragmentation of produce in India. The other point is that our experience with central legislations have always not been pro-markets or pro-trade. So don't imagine that you have a central legislation creating a national APMC and a national body will necessarily promote trade. No, I'm saying that we need to be cautious about it because I'll give you the example of FSSI, which was an industry-led regulation. The food standard safety was led by industry. Industry said that, and I was a part of that reform, that there are too many laws, let's bring it out in one law. And now you've created the food inspector who the state governments had forgotten about the last 15 years. He's suddenly revived. Because now you are saying that it is not registration, it's a license. And it has to be online. How do I do it online? You have to find the challan. Challan kaise karenge? That account code has to be given at a price. I will not even be told what account number is the account to be debited in. So you created a huge new environment which the country had actually forgotten about, the food inspector. So I'm just suggesting that when you're creating a new food act, please do not revive the food inspector. Please, because it was meant to be. I'm saying that since we're talking about national regulator and national legislation, it frightens industry sometimes. That's my last comment. Thank you.
Basically, I absolutely agree that state intervention in agricultural marketing is something which is a very hot topic, and it is something which is there. And I also agree that this was started, during the 50s and 60s when there was a need for it. At that time, yes, just after independence there was a need, and right now it's not at all. It's totally anachronistic. And but slight, in ECA with respect to essential commodities, there was an amendment made in 2002 and 3 when all these licensing requirements were removed. And that really eased. That was the beginning of liberalization in the agricultural sector. But soon after, because of the 2006 price rise and all that, it was clamped back. All the orders were kept in abeyance, and now we are still in that regime only. We have not gone back. And with respect to APMC, I think there is a major problem with respect to the way APMC Act itself has been drawn. The APMC, which is a marketing committee, is a big player in the market. But they are also in charge of giving licenses to the contract farmers, to the private markets. Now, why would they do that? So you can't expect a big player to issue licenses for other players to come into the market. Similarly, for farmers, they will not ever allow any other market. That's why you have those 25-kilometer things, and you have a lot of license fee. I believe some other state has, I think Andhra, has put in some 50,000 rupees as a license fee if you want to set up a private market and all that. So they will not allow it. So the way it has been done, the act itself is at fault. I mean, there's a conflict of interest right here, so it's not going to work. So definitely it needs to be changed. If you want to enable a national market, yes, that has to be changed. And repealing, really not sure, like you said about Bihar. It is very true. Bihar, it has to be seen. The farmers they are in a pathetic situation where they really sell in distress. And in fact, what we were told was when I went to Bihar, they said the farmers from Punjab, they come and procure grains from Bihar for conversion to PDS. That's how it happens. So this is actually a market for Punjab. So, and if they bring it to the, like he said, the national highways, if they bring it to the railway stations, they get a better price, but still below the MSP. So that's how it functions. So just repealing alone is not enough. What is required is an alternative structure, which is like if the private investment in the form of, say, even these mills had come up in Bihar, then the farmers would have had some place to go to. You don't even need a structure if you just need another investment. But then that needs the state government's, if the state government is not willing to do it, then you can't help that also. So just repealing this without setting it right, probably what we can do is set right the APMC Act itself because of the conflict of interest involved. And basically you need a long-term, it's really a long-term issue which you have to look into various aspects of it. If you peel one layer, you get other layers which are, they throw up more things. But what I was interested in knowing was, you said the license fee, even if you're not participating, you have to pay. Which state would this be?
Many states require not the license fee, the mandi fee.
It's a mandi fee.
So if you sell a unit of a product, you have to pay a mandi fee.
If you're selling, yes.
No, but within the area. Even if you don't use the physical infrastructure of the APMC.
No, that is right. If you, that they have to pay. If it's in the market area which has been defined by the marketing committee, then yes.
So the absurdity is it's called a fee. It's like I sold some Reliance shares personally. I don't have to pay National Stock Exchange anything if I didn't transact on National. How can it be a fee and I still have to pay it when I didn't?
That is the platform which is provided. That is the APMC Act itself. You can't go out of that. That is the Act.
Meaning you've declared
it's an area,
half a city or part of the city, regular existing market as a regulated market. Whoever is doing business there pays a mandi fee. That's the point.
You know the point? Even if you and I do a private off-market transaction, we owe him the
Yes.
Yeah, you have to. That is what the.
It is courts have held this not to be a tax because they permitted the cess, for instance, to be used to connect a road from the place of.
That's how it is justified. That's how it is.
So therefore, again, legally it has been held to be.
Legally it is there.
Valid.
Yeah.
Punjab case Supreme Court, full 5 judgment.
You want to come back into this?
Why we got into this question of national market at all. So when we started thinking about markets where there is clear markup pricing here, so that is, that these are not competitive markets. So you want competitive markets. Then, everybody told us, Bihar, oh yeah, so clearly APMCs create conditions to prevent competition. Right? So you can't have a competitive market if there is an APMC law there because you need a license, there are entry barriers, you can't trade, you can't buy or sell without a license. So they obviously give you a market that cannot be a competitive market. So then we started thinking, okay, so you want to repeal the APMCs. And then everybody told us, Bihar. Local monopolies have taken over. And so it's not as if you have had this, it's maybe the same people. And what you're telling me is worse, that even the local monopolists have run away. But earlier it was that the same traders were now local monopolies. So then the question arose, how can you ensure competition in that market? Could it be that if you allow, how do you break that local monopoly? Whether it is for historical reasons, earlier it might have been because of the act, but today it might be because of historical reasons. How can you get in more players into the market? One way could be to give people a pan-India license. What we are calling a national market is essentially any players who want a pan-India license. Now, if you think of the example that Shubho gave, that where because there is an APMC, you can't have a private market within 25 kilometers. So then today the fellow from Punjab or whoever, some let's say a ketchup company, cannot buy tomatoes in different parts of the country. He'll have to do deals with each one, and within that he would be restricted as well. So you want to, not just remove the barriers, the legal barriers to competition, which repealing the APMCs would do, but to bring in other players, and that was the logic for saying that to get the market to be a competitive market, we need national players in the market, and that's why I talk about a national market.
Permit, which then encourages firms to think in a different way. So you want entry by people, by firms that are willing to play this on a giant scale. Whereas otherwise, state by state, it's just much more work, and you won't develop those firms.
And another thing that seems to be happening is that in other countries, you see this business broken down into many, many, many small parts. So there might be a national company, and all it does is it grades tomatoes. So it sorts and says, this is the variety of tomatoes. And that's all it does. Now, if that company is doing it in one state, it may not be profitable. And today we don't have those layers of businesses in the, I'm sure that people here know so much more about this than me. But the sense we got was that because you have, the APMC doesn't allow this and doesn't allow that. The APMC Act doesn't allow it, and you're right that if they are the regulator and a participant, they're not going to allow it. So that's natural. But today, because they don't allow it, other businesses are not able to enter, and those would be maybe make business sense only if they're at a national scale. So that's how the two are.
Okay, Ila, your session started 15 minutes late. Now we're 25 minutes late. Okay, so we shall break for coffee and quickly bring our coffee back. Anirudh, you want to say something?
Yeah. So I just wanted to push back slightly against Sir's point about constitutional power. The entries we pointed out are fairly neutral and enabling. So if courts have held that doing all sorts of local restriction is legal, I'm fairly sure they'll also hold our framework for a national market to be legal. So I think the entries and constitutional provisions are agnostic.
Idea for national licenses. And that was the exact demand that the exchange had said, please give us I think NBC is
the answer is partly
there is also ask for
no national legal framework under which you can give a
maybe
national license.
Maybe
That's the
that
point being made. If I want to be a national operator, currently I can't even be a state operator. APMC Bangalore has to give me a permission.
Actually, just like to share with you that 3 years back, the Department of Agriculture and Cooperation had moved a proposal on these lines to set up a national body which will actually license traders and middlemen, intermediaries all over the country. So, they were in the middle of exploring and doing inter-ministerial consultations, and we had actually formed a committee in the Department of Food.
Ministry of Agriculture.
Ministry of Agriculture, Department of Agriculture and Cooperation had done this, and so the constitutional validity, etc., also was being looked into. As a matter of fact, when we are trying to draft a law for regulating spot exchanges in the country, we were told by the Ministry of Law and Justice that the constitutional provisions do not allow central government to legislate on a spot exchange for the reason that we have already mentioned interstate trade is in the union list. Within the state, it's in the state list. When only item 33 on the concurrent list allows you central government to legislate in respect of foodstuff and jute and a few commodities. So for the rest of the commodities, the interstate trade cannot be legislated upon by the central government. That's what they had pointed out. But you can look at this note, this Agriculture Ministry note, and their proposal for a law, and that could be interesting actually. Sorry, this was in 2011.